Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining us on this panel. I hope you've had a fantastic lunch. techUK always does us proud with the food. But whilst you are digesting, please bear in mind that there are many people out there who are unable to put food on their table or indeed have a table to put it on. And so I would urge you to please donate to the techUK Crisis Christmas Appeal. I think the details were up on the screen. We might be able to get them back. Yes, techUK are raising money for Crisis at Christmas, and it's a fantastic cause that enables people to be given hot food and a place to sleep over the course of Christmas. So if you're willing and able, please do consider donating to the Crisis Appeal. If you go to justgiving.com and look up techUK, you will find that appeal. Thank you. So this afternoon we're going to be discussing public engagement and democracy. And I think so far today, we've already had some fantastic provocations, starting off with Elizabeth Denham asking us, who's around the table, who's involved in the discussions and the debates about digital ethics and the development of AI. Are the right people involved? How are they engaged? And so on. So I think that was a very good start for us for this session, in fact. The discussion we're going to have today is around public engagement and democracy. Are we getting it right? Who's involved? Who's missing? Very importantly, how inclusive and democratic is it? I think there's some really interesting questions here about the language we use. Digital ethics, is that a phrase in and of itself that feels somewhat excluding? And we're going to be exploring questions about the way in which public engagement is being undertaken, and see if we can find some good examples, or indeed some places where we think that engagement might just be sort of lip service, and is engagement having the kinds of impacts and effects that we would want it to have, particularly when it comes to really fundamental questions about our democratic processes. So to help us navigate this fascinating and very complicated terrain, I'm joined by a stellar panel this afternoon. I'm just going to introduce them all, and then we're going to ask for the provocation that will then lead into a further discussion. So in order, we have with us today Stephen Guinness, who's Research Director at Ipsos Mori, with expertise in a range of mixed methods and social research, a very extensive background there. We then have Elena Sinnel, who's founder of Teens in AI, with a fantastic strapline, I have to say, on their website. AI is shaping the world. Who will shape AI? I think a brilliant provocation for all of us. And Teens in AI focuses on meetups, networking, hackathons, basically trying to get the younger generation of people interested and engaged and involved in these really fundamental questions about the development of shaping of AI, particularly in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. And next to her, we have Helen Margaret, Professor of Society and the Internet at the University of Oxford, and also the Director of the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute. Helen is a widely published author and political scientist focused on digital governance and politics, with a particular focus on ethics and public engagement, and how democracy and government can be impacted through engagement. And then finally, we have Simon Burrell, who's a senior associate at Involve, the UK's leading public participation charity. I've worked with Simon extensively. He's done a huge amount of public engagement and involvement work, particularly on questions around data and digital development. Unfortunately, Nina Schick, who is due to join us, is unable to be with us today. She's a political advisor at Dahlia Research, but unfortunately she's got childcare challenges, so sends her apologies. So to kick off, I'd like to ask Stephen to provide a bit of a provocation for us around public engagement and democracy. Are we getting it right? How inclusive and democratic is public engagement in digital ethics?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me here. I've not been fortunate enough to join the morning discussion, so I hope what I say adds to some of that. It sounds like, from what Natalie says, some of these themes have kind of already appeared. But just to introduce myself, I'm here really as a practitioner, so I'm a research director in our Social Research Institute, and over the last 5 years or so, I've been working on a number of different public, deliberative and dialogue work, thinking back to government data science partnership on just their use of data ethics, around the administrative use of data, around open banking for Barclays, and also more recently, just fresh from finishing a kind of summer of field work for the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, all around online targeting and the extent to which our kind of online experiences are personalised. But I'd also like to try it and pretend that I'm a technologist, at least for this session, in that what my other role is also thinking about kind of how we use innovative methods, new data, new techniques in research more broadly at Ipsos Murray. And so we've had to grapple with some of these issues from both sides and also think about trust and our use of social media data in particular, what's ethically appropriate, not just what's technically possible. So I hopefully bring a number of different perspectives. And it's nice to be able to provocate for a change. I'm used to moderating and being very sensible and reasonable, so I hope these are constructive and useful provocations. And I'd like to offer one challenge and two provocations. I think the first challenge is really, and I think potentially, others on the panel are more able to speak about this than I, but if we think about getting public engagement right and shining a light on what should be better, I think traditionally we think, are we getting the right people in the room? Are we asking them the right questions? But as a practitioner, I hope it's okay to say that the real challenge seems to be that is the value really, how far do the insights and results get embedded into the client organisation, and how do you get senior buy-in and trust in that process? So that's just my first challenge, and I'm going to return now to safer ground as a practitioner and offer two provocations which hopefully come through on the screen. I've only got a couple of slides. But the first is hopefully a fairly interesting challenge, is that should we actually continue with heterogeneous samples in public dialogue? And I think, for us, we spent many years, and our kind of go-to principle really has been to bring together heterogeneous samples that are broadly aimed to be reflective of the UK, bring together people with different perspectives so that they can hear what each other has to say, learn about their attitudes and experiences, and kind of evolve together. And sometimes find common ground, or sometimes find kind of principles which can be used for later into the research. And I think our assumption is that the best way for dialogue about the future of data and digital ethics is to bring everyone together. And in recent years, we've done that for kind of administrative data, as I've mentioned, about healthcare, banking, and more recently around kind of online targeting. And that's been looking at the benefits and harms of the way in which personalized data is used in the online services and kind of products we see. And a common thread through all of these and my experiences is that attitudes to data ethics and digital ethics don't sit in isolation. And I'm sure that's not headline news for you guys. But they are based in kind of wider perceptions and attitudes and assumptions about how the world should work and how we want it to work. And so I think this became really apparent in our online targeting dialogue, where some of the responses that people gave were embedded based on their trust in organisations to pay taxes, on how capable they thought government was in resolving Brexit, in how much belief they had in actually technology to create kind of accurate assumptions about them and others based on data. And what's interesting is that, as our topics become more esoteric and new information, we need new information to present to people, and through the deliberative process, potentially these underlying assumptions become even more important and form a springboard for which they're kind of processing of all this information, or a lens in which they see this through. And I think sometimes we like to pretend this isn't the case, but it's true that sometimes there's so many differences of opinion, contrasting values and views expressed in a day, that it can be really difficult to distill that down. And at times, kind of the underlying principles can appear a bit bland. We talk time and time again about transparency, or about things that kind of public benefit. And that actually perhaps these are the principles because they are just the kind of average of the discussion of values that we've experienced so far. But what if we do it a different way? What if we recruit people based on the different values that we already know they have, rather than actually identifying those being part of the outcomes from the dialogue process? And we can have similar types of dialogues, but also tailor our dialogues to those with different views. We've explored different types of segmentation before at Ipsos Murray, thinking back a few years to our data science partnership, where we identify data adopters and adapters and pragmatists. But often our work to date has been quite just confined to thinking about how people view data. And one of the things we've been doing this summer at Ipsos Murray, which we're particularly excited about, is a global trend survey. So that's 33 countries. We've done 3 waves of this now over a number of years. And that gives a huge, accurate picture of the values held by the world and how these values are changing. And what we've done is some interesting factor analysis, which is a statistical term for basically looking at which of these underlying values are really important in shaping your views on everything, from climate change to data to use of different technologies to how you feel about governments and the role of the state. And what we've done then is also clustered how these different views appear. And I just wanted to share a little bit of where we've got to. And this is not going to be visible for those of you at the back of the room. I apologize for that. So I'll try and explain what we've got going on here. I think so this is a kind of statistical process, not driven really by our own value judgments, just looking at statistically where does variation occur and how values are come together. And essentially we end up with a kind of top to bottom, that should say past and future here. It's got cut off, but essentially that's your judgment of time. Are you someone who really wants to harper back to the good old days of the past or look to the future? And between left and right, you've got change over on the right-hand side. Are you someone who's a big proponent in change or someone who's quite conservative in what you want to be happening in the world? And actually the biggest value that we saw that was driving a whole range of different kind of attitudes was climate change. And number 4, thank you very much. Number 4, as you can see in this bottom-hand side, was actually attitudes to regulating big tech. That was a huge kind of factor in how you felt about lots of different things. And you'll see I've identified in yellow your attitudes to data ignorance, anxiety, technophobia, whether you're an early adopter. Actually, they kind of situate themselves in how you feel about the society and world in themselves. So you have the different categories that we've got are kind of pessimistic values, optimistic values, you're traditional, or you're more radical in your thinking. And that got us quite excited, I think, in thinking about what we should be doing. And I think how does that relate to data ethics? So, for example, actually, maybe we recruit people based on those values, and we know that some very different values are going to lie underneath our attitudes towards data, kind of attitudes to technology and data. So you might have someone who's kind of future-orientated or change-orientated in this bottom right, and so you're likely to be more radical about the way you want to see the world change, plus being worried about the role of big tech and whether that should be regulated. And perhaps, therefore, you'll come up to a discussion around data sharing from this perspective. On the other side of the board, actually, you're someone who's quite optimistic about the future, and you don't really see a need for change, and you believe you get a huge amount of value out of it. And as such, you're an early adopter, and you have a completely different perspective. So our challenge, hopefully, and this is something we see in a range of different projects, is just whether we should actually be bringing heterogeneous samples together all of the time, or should we be doing something different? Should we be creating different series of materials and be speaking to these groups in different ways? And it might be actually that they need different bits of information, and they don't all need to see the same information to make judgments about how they want the world to work and what they think needs changing. And so my second provocation is, I'm now moving left to right. Could I ask you to move that on? It's just, are we talking too much about the present, and should we really be talking as much about the future? And I think one of the things that struck us as we were looking at this kind of global trends map, really, is that the different segments map quite nicely onto kind of data's archetypes, and the idea of alternative futures and how you view the future, that there's not just one type of future, but there's actually a kind of series of different alternative futures, and that's just one way of looking at it, but it appeared like an interesting model for us. And again, this is slightly faded for us, but you have over in the bottom corner here, you have this idea of growth and kind of continuation, the status quo, but you're following on the same trends and trajectory. On the opposite side, if you're someone who's a bit more pessimistic, there's a risk that the whole system becomes dysfunctional and collapses. And the bottom right-hand side, you've got a radical transformation happening or perhaps in this top left-hand corner, you've got a kind of more discipline or new equilibrium as we kind of place new constraints on the way in which we want the world to work. And I think this also kind of chimed with some of the things we've learned recently in our public dialogue. So, we have one of the classic things that we try to do as practitioners is to make things concrete, give people lots of examples about what's happening now. And as I've said, we've talked about a huge number of really abstract things in our recent dialogues. And we're using case studies and examples of how different data sharing choices might play out or how the technology works. But the challenge is that some kind of decisions might play out for individuals differently in the future, but also may impact societies in a different way. And we're often asking people to kind of grapple with that concept of what it means for them as an individual, and also what it means for societies, communities, infrastructure, economy, and just our social fabric. So the other challenge is that some risks are easier to absorb than others, and some benefits are easier to imagine. And this came out in our Centre for Data Ethics dialogue, where participants were found it very comfortable to talk about the impact of personalised kind of information and content and services on them as an individual, but found it really difficult to kind of take that to what if everyone has the same outcome? What does that mean for society? Does that mean we become more narrowed, more polarized? Does it have an impact on debates and in the end, potentially the outcomes of general elections? So these are big questions that are all very important for what we do now, but it was a real struggle to get people to that point. And I think we commend the work of Nesta and others on democratizing futures, and we think potentially that the idea of bringing kind of futures together with dialogue is a missing jigsaw piece that could really add value. Our challenge here is, without a shared collective idea of the future that we want to see, we can't meaningfully talk about the impact of things such as kind of the fake news on our political life. But that challenge doesn't come without its challenges itself. It's quite difficult to create the stimulus and the materials and think about what the different kind of potential futures might look like. And it's also difficult, returning to my very first challenge, to get kind of senior buy-in to something that is even more kind of distant from a more traditional research approach. And so I think one of the things we're hoping to do in thinking about what we can do better and making kind of public engagement more democratic at Ipsos Mori next year is to bring we've got a trends and futures team and we've got a dialogue team, and we want to bring them together to and bring hopefully collaborators together to identify best practice, trial out some new different methods, and also do some of our kind of additional analysis on that global trends data. So if you're interested in joining that vision and helping think about the way in which that could work, please do come and see me and get in touch. Thank you.
Fantastic. What brilliant provocations to kick us off with. So I think starting with where you ended up thinking about futures and how we talk about futures, Elena, I'd like to start with you in thinking about how we talk about the future and as you work on kind of shaping AI. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in working with young people when trying to envisage that future? What kind of range of views are you seeing? How easy is it to actually have conversations about AI and where it's taking us in society?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and a very interesting, provocative questions that we've just suggested. So for me personally, we've been in the space for 5 years now, and we've been working with teenagers across the globe, and we've just recently had Microsoft who adopted the framework that we've been developing, and this will be now rolled out in 150 countries. So we hope there will be a lot of girls in particular engaged into our initiatives, and we'll be really exploring topics that we're all grappling with on ethics and AI and the potential impact of technology on the societal changes. So it has been quite slow. Obviously, in the initial stages, back in 2015, 2016, it was very difficult to see that adoption happen because the schools couldn't quite understand why I was trying to do what I was trying to do and why those conversations were really important. So to begin with, we just introduced technologies in general and exploring and developing technologies with teenagers, mentors, and so many different stakeholders. So that's public engagement at its core. And very recently, only in the past 2 years, really, we dived into AI, and very accidentally, actually. It was just a teenager who was very, very passionate about AI, who was feeling very suicidal, and came to me and asked me to engage his mind, a very genius mind that he was. He's at Imperial at the moment. And so my journey into AI was something that I really didn't expect. So it was very unexpected, and we ran a mental health hackathon with teenagers to see what teenagers saw as solution to mental health problems. And I saw that was so impactful. The kind of technologies they were exploring and using during that hackathon was highly inspiring, and so we thought it would be great to explore those technologies even further. But it wasn't until last year that we introduced ethics or human-centered AI, and we really take all of the latest methodologies and try to bring it, demystify it to the level of teenagers and see what really happens when we offer problems like climate change, like mental health, to teenagers to see how they will be able to solve and what kind of approaches they will find. And it was interesting to see that a lot of the teenagers we work with, unfortunately, they are the boys and girls of CTOs or people who are already in tech, whereas I am trying to engage boys and girls who are from underrepresented backgrounds, and it's very hard to find or to source them in a way where people who we tend to engage with, who are teachers, for instance, will really see the value of the programs we run. So adoption in education in general is is very, very slow. It's taken us quite a while. We've calculated it's been over 5,000 children that we worked with across the world. We see adoption much easier and faster in dictatorial countries. So outside of UK, we find there is definitely more interest in the programs and frameworks that we run, which is very sad. So so it's been an interesting journey, but we've just had some great news that we've received that Microsoft will now be rolling this out across 150 countries. So we hope there will be even more engagement, and the majority of those who will be engaged will be girls at this stage. So we will see. Thank you.
Fantastic. What interesting work you're conducting. And I just wanted to pick up on that point you made about sort of the value of engagement, and I suppose also draws on what Stephen was talking about in terms of sort of getting the senior buy-in and bring you in at this point, Helen, because a lot of the work that you do is around trying to basically create better governance and ensure that the views and perspectives of a range of people kind of can be built into that. Do you see engagement work having a real impact in practice in the way that governments develop policies and processes from the work that you've done and the public programs, the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute?
Thank you. Well, yes, I would like to talk about a couple of examples of that, but perhaps first of all I'll tackle your question about the future rather than the present. And I'd actually like to put in a plea for the past. We're very used to the idea of, and this is what AI ethics is all about, of kind of blaming AI, machine learning and so on, for everything bad, bias, discrimination, sort of the idea that ruthless robots are making decisions about our lives, being completely opaque and non-explainable, non-transparent. And I just want to sort of remind us that very often and it's usually machine learning, but let's call it AI because we all call it AI at the moment. What it's often doing is revealing those things that were like that already. So when Amazon throw away their hiring algorithm because they can't make it be anything less biased than they had before, it's because all that, as I'm sure all of you know, it's because of all of that training data that it's based on is in fact biased. Why is it biased? Because of all the decisions that they've made in the past. A lot of bias that's there in machine learning relates to bias that's in the system already, because judges come from really homogenous groups, for example. And I think rather than looking at ethics, which for many people, not for everybody here, otherwise you wouldn't have come, but I think for many of the people who are building AI, and perhaps for many in the general public, it's A, a very boring, empty topic, and B, it's about stopping you doing interesting things and exciting things. And I really think we should move away from that and actually use ethical frameworks and ethical principles and values as a way of building governmental systems better than we had before. So, for example, measurement. We couldn't measure bias properly before, so we didn't kind of know we had it. And at least now we know, and that gives us much more of a chance of doing something about it. And I think all of those things that all the bad things, you can flip around like that. So take the question of explainability. Government is incredibly bad at being explainable. Traditionally, government has not been very explainable. It's very opaque to citizens. Sentencing decisions. How much explanation have people had about sentencing decisions or the way that their healthcare is delivered? So I do think we have to talk about the past as well, because that's going to give us a better future, one where we overcome those kind of systemic biases in the system. So that's one point. The second point, so yes, we're doing a lot of work on ethics in the public policy programme, as well as a lot of work on actually building the tools to try and make government better. That's the idea of the programme. But the ethics can make government better. We have been doing work on explainability. We've been working, actually, I think there's at least one person, if not two people, from the Information Commissioner's Office talking about this topic in other panels. But I suppose by definition, if you're here, you're not there. So you won't get to hear about the Explain project, which is a very interesting project that the Turing worked on jointly with the ICO, where we ran citizens' juries in Coventry and Manchester about what citizens thought about explainability, what they thought, what kind of explanation they thought should be provided in the area of healthcare and criminal justice and other things as well. And so just, I don't know, 2 or 3 insights from that. One is that it's very difficult. Building explainability into processes requires rigorous scientific research, just the same way as building an algorithm, a good algorithm does. It requires the expertise of people like Maury and other companies which are experts in producing, you know, representative samples or whatever samples we decide we want. It requires time. I mean, our citizens' juries were 5 days. That's a lot of time. It requires education. And we found that citizens were very appreciative of that. I mean, they actually enjoyed the process, which sounds rather amazing, but they felt empowered by that process, that it was actually sort of, you know, they were being paid for it, but they actually felt empowered by it. And they kind of realized that education and explanation take a lot of resources, money as well. We had to ship experts into those citizens' juries, and you know, they had 5 days of sort of discussion of these topics. And they also had very sort of sophisticated ideas about the kind of explanations they wanted. And again, it's this comparison with the past. How much explanation do you get about how drugs work, how heart drugs or cancer drugs work? How much do you want? Possibly not very much. And that was what we found, actually. We offered them a number of scenarios where they kind of, you really have to present people with trade-offs in these situations, were what we felt. So we had a sort of 3 scenarios where something was 95% accurate, but you had no explanation, 85% accurate, and you had a partial explanation, and 75%. And people really, you know, there were lots of ways in which they were happy with partial explanations in certain situations, because, of course, it's partly a question of expectation. What we have at the moment is not very much explainability about things like healthcare. And perhaps in those situations we require less, or we expect less. But we do require things like safety and performance explainability, what are the procedures, and accountability. You know, who's responsible for this? What's the human in the loop kind of thing? So we found very sophisticated ideas and kind of choices that people were willing to make. And I think there's a lot of scope for basically making governmental processes better, building those things in, and possibly, you know, making government better than it was before.
Making government better than it was before, just given our current location and the time of year and what's happening tomorrow, it's a plea we can probably all subscribe to. Just to note, if you've got questions, I've certainly got questions buzzing from these discussions already. Please do put your questions on Slido. If you go to slido.com, the hashtag is digital ethics, and I'll take a look and see if there's any that we can pick from the audience, in addition to raising your hand if you would like to ask your question yourself. So Simon, I'd like to come to you now, and we've still got this fantastic quadrant up. Oh, we did have there we go. We did have the quadrant up that looks incredibly rich and looks like there's a huge amount of kind of nuance and diversity in the way that those segmentations have been done. But I'd like to ask you, where do you think the gaps are in the engagement work that's been done and what we currently know about public views and digital ethics?
So thanks very much, and thanks for everybody for coming. There's been a lot of very rich engagement of the sort that Stephen and Helen have been talking about in terms of citizens' juries, public dialogues, where you bring relatively small groups of the public together for relatively long periods of time, giving them a chance to hear from experts and then to deliberate on the evidence they've heard and then on the policy questions. And these sorts of deliberative processes can have quite profound impacts on policy processes. They can change policy quite profoundly. And we've seen this not just in the data arena, but also in nanotechnology, human-animal chimeric cells. I mean, a whole range of really quite profound scientific research and innovation. The problem with these processes is they bring together 50, 100, if you're very, very lucky, 200 people if you've got enough money and time. But then they kind of get sent back out into society. I've been calling it the homeopathy theory of public engagement. Why will this very small group of people who are diluted back into society have an impact on the wider public debate? So these things can have an impact on the decisions that policymakers make, those with power make, but they don't really involve the wider public. And so the title of this session is Public Engagement and Democracy. And I think that one of the gaps is how do we make these thoughtful kind of spaces of kind of calm deliberation actually have an impact on the wider debate. So there are a number of gaps. How do we begin to plug that gap? How do we make this engagement sustainable? It's quite expensive, not if you compare it to the costs and impact of the technology, but still for a policymaker asking them to spend a couple of £100,000 to bring together 50 or 100 people feels expensive. It has a feel of expensiveness to it. So what would a less expensive, sustained and sustainable engagement look like? So we're working with Camden Council, North Lanarkshire, Scottish Government and Alan Turing to train up community facilitators who are going to be then engaging with community groups over the course of a year and have an iterative program of deliberative engagement, relatively short engagements, maybe half an hour to 3 hours, so they won't be deep and in-depth like the sort of stuff that happens in citizens' juries and dialogues. But can we begin to kind of set up a networked conversation with community groups in spaces where there's already community engagement, begin to build understanding of the use and role, in this case, of health and social care data, and connect North Lanarkshire Council and Camden Council into community groups who are willing and able and begin to see the relevance of a conversation about health and social care data to their own lives and the policy and decisions that are being taken at the council level. So can we kind of set up a kind of sustained networked deliberation? I just, in terms of the gaps, I'm not so sure about the kind of heterogeneous, can't say it, sample and your challenge as to whether we should be looking for value sets and particularly whether we should be giving people different types of information. I really, really worry that in our democracy we're all beginning to work from different types of information, and unless we're all, there's a shared understanding of what we're basing these decisions on, we're actually going to make it less democratic, less transparent. And so I guess my final point would be proper transparency. And I do also wonder whether this isn't a question about data at all. So it's not only is it not really a question about data ethics, I don't even think it's a question about data. The conversation we're having about data is really what should we be using data for to make what decisions? And the problem, and so in the end, the state is going to use data to potentially penalise some groups over others for actions they're taking, or to deliver services to some groups and not others. That's politics, that's power. And it's really in the outcome that we need the conversation. And so data is clearly critical to that conversation, and data could make these decisions much more effective, much more efficient. But in the end, citizens are going to care about whether their hospital is closed as a result of the data that's been used to show that it's delivering bad results or whatever it is. And what citizens are going to care about is not the basis of the decision, but the fact they've lost their hospital and whether it was the right decision to make or not. So I think we need to be thinking about how we move this conversation to be about data and outcome and not just about privacy, security, and the types of data that should be used.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that point around sort of getting to the concrete outputs and the impacts is so important. In an earlier session, Simon McDougall from the ICO talked about needing to move towards getting down to the really gritty issues. So what kind of trade-offs do we need to make? Where are the specific challenges in relation to concrete use cases and tangible examples? But I wonder if the panel, if you have any thoughts on how you can kind of square that circle where you've got, on the one hand, some quite big societal, conceptual, abstract issues like privacy and equity and justice and those sorts of things that, in a sense, if we're going to create a kind of a digital ethics for everyone, you sort of have to have that universal, quite big picture understanding and framing of the issues, but at the same time, if you're going to be talking to people on the ground, people who probably wouldn't be caring about this sort of stuff in their day-to-day life, it's not necessarily very salient to them, there you need those concrete, tangible, specific use cases and examples. Is it possible to kind of get both of those things in balance? Any thoughts from the panel?
Well, I see as we've got the microphone. I think the one thing we forget is the public are talking about these issues already. So the other gap there is that these deliberative processes currently are driven very much by the people over there and just slightly beyond in 100 Parliament Street and so on. They're their concerns, where the questions come from for policymakers. But the public are talking about issues of justice, of fairness and so on. They may not be using the kind of wonk words, but they may well be as well. But rather than kind of actually engaging with the public where the public are at, we're kind of creating these sterile environments where we draw them in like lab rats. They have power. Much of my career, last 10 years, has been spent in doing that, but they do have power, so don't get me wrong, they're useful. But we shouldn't forget the public having these questions already, and we should be finding ways to engage with the public where they are. Just one very brief anecdote. We're running a different form of deliberative dialogue in a very, very different policy area, which has been commissioned, a couple of £100,000 being spent by a big Whitehall department, and we're trying to get informants from within this department, experts from within this department, to go to Kendal, Chesterfield and various other places. So I sent out an email saying, can you come? Here are the dates and the locations. And I got one response back from one very senior policymaker saying, whereabouts in London is the one in London? Not, I can come to the one in Chesterfield, but actually I may not even make the one in London if it's in the wrong place. If people in Whitehall don't want to go out and actually listen to what the public are saying, we're in a real mess.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it comes to the crux of so many moments of flashing back of how you try and reconcile that. And we've attempted lots of different things, from looking at kind of both the in-depth dialogue perspectives and the more quantitative perspectives, where you can place a whole range of different scenarios in front of people and see if there's anything, any underlying principles. And that's just made me think about that. One of the other challenges, I think, is the kind of the rational response versus the more visceral, automatic, or potentially you don't even realize that those are your beliefs, or where you're making judgments and helping people realize some of the kind of the views that they have, or how they're making judgments. And I think, and hopefully, there is a role for also new technology and research, thinking about with my other hat, as we're starting to understand more kind of visceral biometric responses to different kind of situations. So I just wonder, I think one of the other gaps might be, as well, is people not only find it difficult, but some of the times we found that there is a difference between what people say, how they want to make judgments, and trade off exactly that in the specific context, before actually then the sequencing of that is quite important. Then you might scale up to some kind of principles, and that if you have a different exercise where you're not asking them to talk about the detail, they actually start trading off different things that they perhaps aren't consciously aware of what they're trading off, but it tells you something else about their kind of values. And so I'm not sure I have an answer, but that's maybe another lens which we need to think about in trying to reconcile those two together.
I think for me the main gaps actually lie in education. I don't know what kind of information kids are getting at the moment and who from, but those issues that we are discussing here, they're not really discussed in education. Teenagers don't have access to those information. Hardly anyone really understands all the implications for the ethics or technology. And many teenagers that we have in our network that have been exposed to some of the latest cutting-edge technologies or thoughts around AI and data science, they actually question the very notion of democracy. They question, who can we trust and who is really in control of all of this data, given all the latest that has been coming out around Cambridge Analytica, or who holds that patient data, and is it is it okay to sell that data to the big corporates, like the latest Amazon discovery that came out very recently? So a lot of teenagers that we have in our network, ask those kind of questions. They all watch TED Talk by Carol Calwater and about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or talk about the role of Facebook in sharing and spreading the fake news, or the role of social media in during political debates or campaigns. So all of these kind of issues, not everyone has got that privilege to this kind of information and debates. So I feel like the gaps are really, and we should really start looking into what discussions and debates we could provoke in the education centre, because teenagers, particularly 16 to 18-year-olds, they really do care. Some of the 16-year-olds are concerned that they're not given the rights to vote in these elections because they have a lot to say. We ran Gen Z hackathon to find out what they actually think, and it was quite incredible to see the kind of solutions they could come up with, some of the problems around Brexit and whatnot, and they are, worried, it's our future, but we're not even allowed to express our opinion. So there are certain voices that are missing out in all of these discussions and conversations, and I feel it's the younger generation we also need to include into all of these debates.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to agree with that, but I would extend it. I think the education piece should really... a lot of the questions we're talking about are actually political questions. What right should you have to know about your government and its relationship with you and how democracy functions? And I don't think we have nearly enough attention paid to that in our education system. When you think of the whole awful debate there's been over the last month or so, years, about, Parliament versus the people, to me it's terrible that phrase is appearing anywhere when Parliament is there to represent the people. And you hear it talked about in such an uneducated way. How can any teenager hope to sort of get a handle on it without, that being prioritised in the education system? And the technology questions, a lot of the technology questions, how we should regulate Facebook, for example, which might sound like a terribly boring question. It's not, and they're not bored by it, and they probably know more about his mic's not very good. And they probably know more about it in lots of ways than older people do. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And the other thing, I totally agree, you have to go to where people are. And where people are, what they experience in their everyday lives. So, I would be inclined, rather than choosing people by their values, which I slightly agree is rather a dangerous idea, you need to choose people. For example, we're doing some work on the use of the ethics of the use of algorithms in child welfare and the question of designating whether children are at risk or not. This is an incredibly controversial use of machine learning, deeply worrying. We didn't really want to get involved in it at first because we don't have the domain expertise about children, but we're working with organisations that do now. But the point is that local governments all across the country are being sold technology which purports to do that and give some sort of accurate statistical probability about individuals. And that's incredibly kind of worrying that local governments are having to deal with that. And they need all the help they can get. So it means everybody, even sort of local government procurement officers, everybody needs to understand these very difficult dilemmas. That's very important. So, for example, we're doing some work. We're just at the beginning of an extension of that piece of work on child welfare algorithms, working with families, working with a family rights group, working with families who've in some way been touched by the use of these technologies. And you can bet as sure as hell they will have really important opinions on sort of what should be explainable and what shouldn't, and what the ethics are. They may not use exactly the same words, but you can find those words, those common words. And I think that's a very important thing to do. We certainly shouldn't give up on that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon.
And just kind of picking up on that thing about this being politics, it's politics at different levels. So Stephen's point about we can do all this great work with the public, but will policymakers actually listen is absolutely right, and one of the reasons my organisation was set up in the first place. And so one of the reasons we use these kind of, I've been calling them sterile, it's very harsh on the methodology, but these kind of very formal methods of public engagement is because in the end, policymakers and politicians struggle with hearing what the public say unless they can recognise it as a robust mechanism. They're very, very worried about whatever they're hearing as being hijacked by what they would call the loudest voices. And so sometimes these methodologies are needed because of the politics of getting the message heard, just as much as because they deliver you robust results. So I think it's often when you're thinking about public engagement, you're trying to hold multiple competing needs in mind. One is, how do you give the public more control over the sorts of questions that are asked, the outputs, the decisions, the kind of representation of their views? And sometimes you have to narrow that control the public have in order just to get the minister or the senior member in a local authority to listen because of their own concerns or wanting to hold on to their own power. So yeah.
Thank you. That leads beautifully on, lovely segue, onto one of the questions we've received from Slido. So I will put this to the panel. It relates very much to the conversation we've been having, and I think particularly because the issues that we're raising here are not really just about technology. They're far bigger than that. They're about, as you say, they're deeply political. They're about the kind of structure of the society that we want. So given that we're dealing with these kind of very deep and big and complex questions, what are the panel's thoughts on citizens' assemblies? And how do we anticipate new and existing technologies supporting those kinds of fora? Does anyone want to take that one on?
Well, given we're running a number of those citizens' assemblies, I probably ought to say something.
Tell us about them, Simon.
So that place over there, it's a place of theatre and politics. One of the reasons it has such an impact on the public debate is because of the theatre of what happens in the chamber and the theatre of what happens around it. Citizens' assemblies are really very good methodologies for bringing together relatively large groups of the public around questions where policymakers and others have yet to form a view or where the politics is stuck. And one of the reasons they can be quite useful techniques is because they are theatrical in their own way. They're a kind of theatrical intervention into the democratic debate. But the problem with them can be that they're not very visible. And so one of the sorts of ways that we might be wanting to think about how technology might support citizens' assemblies is by how you might use some of the streaming technologies, but also how you might bring questions, reactions, both through social media, but other mechanisms into the citizens' assembly, and how you might also use digital technologies to actually support jurors or assembly members to have conversations both within the assembly itself, so to disrupt the formality of the assembly, but also between assembly sessions. So I think there are a number of different ways where you can enhance these processes, both to make what's happening inside them more visible, potentially more theatrical, but also enhance the ability of assembly members to talk between themselves and with the wider public.
Fantastic, thank you. Any other views? Yeah.
No, I think that's a fascinating question. There's a couple of other things that we've done for the first time this summer. We actually had so thinking about that space in between kind of discussions, and especially if the elements are reconvened, how do you create a good space for that? Interestingly, we've struggled sometimes when we've tried to recruit people in a kind of face-to-face environment and then provide them with digital tools in which to take the conversation beyond the room. Actually, we found that that really struggles to go off. If we've recruited people to have a conversation in a digital fora, they really get stuck in. But for some reason, we've struggled, actually. People have so far tended to prefer kind of one or the other. And I'm not quite sure what that is. I don't think it's a technical kind of skills issue, but it's just interesting about how do you set up your initial ask of people to go beyond just having a kind of face-to-face conversation. We've also been doing some digital diaries and asking people to record their experiences and their thoughts as they go. The technology's improved in the way that you can, often that's seen as something that's very time intensive. You get lots of video back, but the technology's improved in the way you can tag and understand and code that information, which is fascinating. And I think one of the other things I saw this year was this idea, again, it's kind of a machine-led learning process, but where the machine listens to the conversations that are happening in a virtual space and identifies questions that should be fed back to the panel, and almost records where attitudes and opinions are changed. And it seems quite radical, and we need to look at it more, but I thought that's an interesting concept just in terms of how technology can help also keep track of the conversation and identifying beyond just the eyes and ears, the note takers and the moderators, what it is that really either changes opinion or changes course, or where people who maybe aren't speaking up as much, kind of where their views are at. So I think there's a number of different ways in which technology could potentially aid the conversation.
I just wanted to express my view on how you collect data without letting people know that there is data being collected on the metadata and they consent. How does that work with that kind of technology you've just given an example of?
So it's all done with consent. So
it's all done with consent. Sorry,
And
what do you do with that data afterwards?
Which bit? Sorry. So kind of the conversation that's happening
all
online.
The bits that...
Yeah, so that one is just actually people having conversation in a digital space in terms of, and they know that the words that they write or what they say will be observed. We've got moderators and observation, so it's not, it's just a way of processing the data to identify the common themes and the most commonly talked about. So we talk quite a lot in our company about kind of humanized technology and not just relying on technology doing it ourselves, but also how it can be kind of supporting researchers to make conversations where at times it can be difficult to get the whole picture. So it's not information going off in different plays, or it's definitely part of the consent process.
Well, even with anonymous data, we do have issues. Sorry, I took that microphone.
I'm no expert on citizens' assemblies, and these guys are, but I would just like to say that I hope that one good thing, or a couple of good things to emerge from our current political crisis, is that we are talking about things like that far more than we used to. Citizens' assemblies are really on the agenda, and we've surely got to do something to help us as a society kind of collectively think about really complex moral and political issues. I remember at the beginning of the sort of deliberative democracy kind of movement, there was a scholar called James Fishkin, who's one of the first things he did, I think he got lots of, 100 people into a house for a weekend to talk about the Maastricht Treaty. I think that was I think it was done with a TV program. And everybody in academia rather laughed at him at the time, a weekend talking about the Maastricht Treaty, how stupid, that's not good, and that's not good television. Well, it doesn't look so stupid now, quite frankly. To have some kind of system for being able to publicly think about really complex issues like that looks like a really super good idea. So I really hope that this is something that becomes widespread. And just to your point about sort of making it more visible to the outside world, another good thing to come out of this crisis is surely the sort of new, I think we do see, and this is partly due to social media, which get the blame for everything, but actually have also both demonstrated and I believe driven a new sort of willingness to engage with these kind of things. Look at Parliament TV. There used to be about 10 people watching it. It's got over 1 million viewers now. So people, it is not inconceivable that people would watch people discussing, well, it's not the Maastricht Treaty anymore, is it? But, so there really are new possibilities there and new ways of doing it, and that's a good thing.
Fantastic. And I want to try and get through a couple more questions before we close up. And I just wanted to pick up the one that's come through on Slido that I think is very relevant and follows directly on, which is around digital exclusion. So we've been talking about the potential role of technology in helping assist and enhance sort of democratic processes and functions and people being able to engage. But digital exclusion is a big issue in the UK and globally. So how do we include those who are offline or who have limited use as part of this very important conversation?
Well, I think to begin with, we should have really defined what public engagement means and what public, because I think there are a lot of people, as you've rightly pointed out, a lot of people who are excluded from these conversations altogether, completely. Not only in other parts of the world, some of the African and Asian countries who are completely excluded from this kind of debate, but also in the UK. I think if you look into some of the stats of .everyone, we know that there are so many completely illiterate people who don't have any accesses, or inequalities and the poverty that still persists in this country that doesn't offer a lot of people to have a say in this matter at all. So I don't know how this is being addressed by the government, but the underlying issue for me is we can have as many discussions as we possibly can online, on Twitter, on social media, but does the government really listen? Does the government really listen to everything that we as a public have to say on this matter? I mean, it will be very interesting to see what happens after the elections and who is really going to be listening to what, or what action this election will result in. But really, ultimately, we see a lot of disengagement. We see a lot of apathy, real apathy. So I really hope people do go and vote for something that really, intrinsic to their own values. But as a result, it will be interesting to see what that parliament is going to look like and what kind of decisions and actions they're going to take. Because we could be talking about these things, on panels as part of so many different conferences, but really it will be down to the public policymakers as to what decisions they will take. And often that will depend on the kind of parties they belong to, or other values they may have, or other interests they may have, or the conversations they have with the corporates that we don't even know about. Behind the scenes, or how do they even make corporates accountable? A lot of corporates get away with paying no tax or very little. Or when something goes wrong, the punishments that they would have on the corporates, the small sums that they have to pay in fines. What difference does it make to the society and to the future public engagement?
Well, however digitally excluded you are, the state is still making decisions about you based on your data. Therefore, obviously, it's essential that we include people who are digitally excluded in this kind of debate. In fact, there's some evidence that those people receive more they're more likely to have decisions made about them through the manipulation of digital data. So, we have to, no methodology can just take people online unless they're talking about some specific. If you want to research if you want to research people's attitudes to Instagram, you might need to just take people who use Instagram. But the kind of things that we've been talking about here, I'd say it would be essential to include everybody.
Fantastic. So I'm afraid we're not going to have time to go through all the questions on Slido, but I hope that our panelists will be sticking around for the coffee. So do feel free to ask then. I'd like to sort of take Chair's prerogative to ask a final question to each of the panelists, which is, this summit is trying to be about action as much as conversation. We can sit in rooms and all nod and agree and say very earnestly that these things matter and they're important and know we must engage and involve more people. But we want to make sure that when we leave this room that we all feel that there's something that we can do, that there's something that we can change, the conversations we can have or action that we can take to hopefully help drive progress forward. So I want to just go down the line and ask each of you briefly, what's your one plea for this audience in relation to this challenge and question around public engagement and democracy? Do you have an ask? Shall I start at the other end?
Yes.
I'll start with Simon, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. So it would be to trust the public. There are spaces you can invite the public into and questions you can ask the public that are stupid spaces and stupid questions, and the public will act stupidly because they've been asked to. If you ask them a question that doesn't mean anything, you're not going to listen to it, you'll get Boaty McBoatface out of it. If you ask them meaningful questions that you're definitely going to listen to and you can demonstrate you are, then the public will engage meaningfully. So trust the public and think about how you're going to involve the public before you even start thinking about the decision, rather than get all the way through to deciding what you're going to do and then saying, oh, we should think about the public as well. Trust the public and engage them early. That was two things.
Okay, so I totally agree with that. But to do that, you need rigorous scientific approach. It's no good just getting a group of people together and calling it a focus group. You need as much sort of effort going into public engagement as you go into some of the other aspects of building technology.
I guess what I would really like, a takeaway that I would really would like to probably leave you with, or a thought perhaps, is, every single one of us have got certain values and something to bring into this discussion and conversation. I would want you to go away today, bringing these matters that we've just been discussing all day today to whatever group that you belong to, whether it is your family or your colleagues, and really talk about digital ethics or technology and the impact it's having on you as a group and the wider society. And each one of us has got the responsibility for what we do, but also how do we ensure that the space that we are creating for the future generation is actually something where they can also come in and be accountable for and feel responsible. So I think we all need to try and act responsibly in accordance with whatever is happening within the politics at the moment. But each one of us really has got to own it, and not just leave this conference thinking, oh, that was really nice and engaging and interesting, but what are you going to do as a result of a conference like this? What will be your personal action be? I'm going to Romania tomorrow, and I'll be spending 4 days working with 120 girls, inspiring them into AI. So I will be talking about ethical issues there. I will be talking about racial biases. I will be talking about Cambridge Analytica. That's what I will do. That will be my weekend. What will you do?
Thanks. I've got one for practitioners and one for commissioners, if that's not too cheeky. Mm-hmm. I think one for commissioners, and I think one of the reflections that's come from this discussion is about being able to kind of situate the discussion around data or digital in actually, quite often we're talking about bigger issues, and that doesn't necessarily come through in the research objectives and how we engage with people. So thinking about, how do we situate this in a wider conversation? And I think that also might help some of the idea around those that are digitally excluded, even if they haven't used the physical piece of technology, they still have an opinion about how they want society to work more broadly. And one for practitioners, I saw the comment that came through on Slido around, is there some kind of place where we can find out all the different information that's been brought together? And I think just a call to collaborate and share. One of the great things about working on these projects and the work of Involve and others is that there often is an evaluation, and that kind of reflective process is really built in. And I think the more we can do to that, and there's a call in my pitch to kind of share and best practice and learn, then we'll be better for it.
Wonderful. So trust, rigor, ownership, collaboration. Fantastic things for us to end on. Would you join me in thanking our panel?